Hey guys, tonight we're sinking our teeth into one of history's most questionable pastries, medieval bread. Not your rustic sourdough from that overpriced artisanal bakery, and definitely not the low-carb miracle loaf that gives you existential dread at 3 a.m. We're talking about bread fresh from the era before gluten-free was even a joke, where the only surprise in your sandwich wasn't ham, but the horrifying secrets lurking in the flour. So before you pass out in a carb-induced coma, go ahead and like the video, subscribe if you can't believe I'm still making these, and leave a comment telling me your worst bread experience. Bonus points if it involved a mystery ingredient. Get your lights dimmed. Put a fan on for those romantic, medieval breeze vibes. And wrap yourself in a blanket fortress that's, hopefully, plague-free. But let's get philosophical. Have you ever wondered what medieval bread actually tasted like? Why did everyone in your textbooks look so exhausted? Was it yeast, or was it something only horrifying Aunt Gertrude would bake with? Did people worry about gluten, or just about not dying from their breakfast? Did sourdough starters occasionally start moving? And if they did, was it a feature or a bug? Would you eat bread that might eat you back? Now, congratulations, you've woken up in 1370. You're hungry, suspiciously itchy, and about 5 minutes away from discovering the most bewildering breakfast of your life. Bon appétit. The sun peeks in through your wooden shutters, which frankly do more for the splinters than for privacy. You roll off your straw mattress and realize your first major task: breakfast. Except, in medieval Europe, breakfast doesn't mean avocado toast. It means bread, the only constant in life, death, and whatever you're about to put in your mouth. Your feet touch the dirt floor, cold, gritty, and the closest thing to a wake-up call you'll get before coffee's invention. You brush straw from your tunic, which at some point was new, but now somehow always smells faintly of turnips and sheep. Overhead, someone, likely a chicken, scratches around the loft for leftover crumbs. You sigh. It's going to be another one of those days. Breakfast preparations are as straightforward as they are uninspiring. Yesterday's coarse loaf sits on your crude wooden table, resembling a catapult projectile more than an appetizing start to the day. You break off a hunk, careful not to chip a tooth. The taste is simple. If you're lucky, someone managed not to overdo the lie this time. Bread is your breakfast, lunch, and honestly, a dental hazard. Butter? That's wishful thinking. Chewing is serious work. You glance around your one-room home, where privacy is as foreign as indoor plumbing. The clay walls are patched from last winter's leaks, and every surface seems to exist to remind you that medieval living is all about layers. Layers of grime, layered garments, and a layering of chores, endlessly. The ceiling beams creak as you move. You wonder if the thatch above your head will last until spring, or if you'll have another indoor rain incident. Family life wakes up alongside you. Your little brother is already poking at the embers in the fire pit, hunting for warmth with tattered mittens that have seen better days. Your mother is bent over yesterday's pot of pottage, muttering about needing more onions and fewer mice. The day's soundtrack is the background chorus of animals, goats, chickens, maybe a neighbour's bleating sheep, already making their opinions heard through your paper-thin walls. After gnawing on bread, you pull on boots caked with yesterday's mud, bracing yourself for the outdoors. From across the lane, a neighbour hollers his own greeting, more a gravelly grunt than a cheery good morning, but medieval pleasantries are a low bar. The main street, if you can call it that, is a narrow winding strip of trodden muck. You sidestep puddles with the ingrained agility of someone who's forgotten more about foot rot than most modern people ever learn. As you make your way outside, morning chores queue up, each as relentless as the church bells that rule your day. Fetching water means a trudge to the communal well, exchanging rumours and rolling your eyes at the village gossip. It's not just about survival. It's a performance, a daily ritual of nods, grunts, and the unspoken competition of who slept the least comfortably. Back indoors, you pass a window just big enough to let in air, but not enough to truly call itself a window. You glance at the garden patch. It's more mud than produce, but one tenacious cabbage you've been rooting for might, with any luck, be edible this month. Every meal, every morning, is a quiet negotiation with famine, fortune, and the fortitude of your family's teeth. All through this, you're acutely aware of the rhythm of village life, the clanging of the blacksmith, the distant murmur from the church, and the nagging suspicion that the next task is going to be dirtier and more repetitive than the last. It's not glamorous, but it's a world where bread, chores, and community define your every dawn. You square your shoulders, finish your crust, and step outside, ready, or at least resigned, for whatever the medieval morning throws at you next. Bread is not just food, it's a way of life. It's the centerpiece of every meal, the Taylor Swift of medieval cuisine. You can't escape it, but before you can eat it, you have to make it. And that's when the trouble starts. Let's set the scene. The year is 1348. The local village smells like livestock, wet hay, and desperation. In every home, from the lord's manor to the humblest peasant's hut, bread rules. It isn't just food. It's the very foundation of survival. No bread means no breakfast, no lunch, no supper, possibly no tomorrow. The obsession isn't just culinary. It's primal, and the pressure to get it right is immense. Medieval bread was not your soft, perfectly sliced supermarket loaf. This was bread with an attitude, a dense, tough, sometimes sour chunk of necessity. White flour, only for the upper crust, pun intended, while peasants gnawed their way through coarse, dark loaves, heavy with bran, and whatever else could be scraped together after taxes. Picture biting into a loaf so hearty, it might as well be medieval Tupperware. Shit stays in, but you're never quite sure if what's inside is still edible. The process itself was its own adventure, or ordeal. First, grain had to be sown, guarded from birds, and harvested by hand. Imagine striking a deal with the weather each season. A little sun, a little rain, and a silent prayer that locusts or famine wouldn't wipe out your future toast. Once harvested, the grain was threshed and cleaned, usually by the entire family. Picture medieval teamwork, everyone working together, sometimes grumpily, always hungrily. Then came grinding. Unless you were the king, or at least knew a guy with a horse, most villagers trudged to the local mill, where the lord took a cut of your grain for the privilege. The millstones didn't just grind wheat, they ground lives. The mill was loud, dangerous, and notorious for slicing off a finger here or there, adding an extra, unintentional source of protein to the grind. The smell of flour hung heavy in the air, mixing with sweat, and sometimes the screams of someone who got too close to the machinery. Once you finally had flour, next came baking. But here's the kicker. Not everyone had their own oven. Firewood was precious, and communal ovens were the Craigslist of medieval baking. Everyone's business, everyone's bread, and inevitably, gossip roasting alongside crusts. The baker's mark, pressed into loaves before they went into the oven, was less about artistry, more about making sure nobody stole your hard-earned daily bread. You could leave with someone else's burnt brick, or worse, nothing at all. Bread failures were the stuff of legends. Burnt bottoms, soggy middles, crusts so tough they could dent armour. Each disaster could spark epic complaints or brawls. Yet, When it worked, pure magic. A crust that could withstand a night's appetite, and an inside soft enough to mop up the last traces of stew. Success was passed around the table, torn into pieces, and briefly, everyone forgot how much work it took. Of course, bread was also social currency. If you were really, really poor, the best you could hope for was maslin, a Frankenstein hybrid of whatever grains hadn't been stolen or ruined by weather. For the rich, there was manchet, airy and refined, signalling status with every bite. Each bite was a statement: who you were, how you lived, and where you ranked. So yes, bread was everywhere, critical to every meal and every life, but never easy. Making bread was hope set to leaven, survival shaped by fire, frustration, and a little luck. To the medieval mind, bread wasn't just sustenance. It was obsession, necessity, creativity, and, if you were very lucky, a moment of simple, chewy joy. Let's talk about flour. Those healthy, fun little wheat berries you see on Instagram. Back then, you're grinding it by hand, inhaling delicious clouds of dust as you work your biceps and question your life choices. Congratulations, it's cardio and carbs. At once. Now, imagine waking up before dawn in a medieval village, not the twinkle-lit, butter-churn TikTok cottagecore fantasy, but the real deal. Cold stone floors, outside your door, someone's already coughing up the first lungful of grain dust. The grindstone, carved from whatever the local geology offered, sometimes volcanic rock, sometimes a slightly less depressing hunk of limestone, sits waiting. You scoop your ration of wheat, spelt, or whatever passable grain survived the last slug infestation and hunch over like you're about to summon the spirit of back pain itself. The actual act of hand grinding grain is repetitive, slow, and unglamorous. Using a quern, a kind of ancient, very basic hand mill, means loading the topstone and using a wooden handle to rotate it in endless circles. You pour grain in, and with each gritty revolution, a bit of flour sifts out the sides. It's hypnotic in the way only monotony can be. Stone against stone. Whir, scrape, whir. Your arms slowly burn, shoulders screaming until you enter a sort of existential fugue. Why am I doing this? Is this what my ancestors dreamed of? Do I even like bread? The flour is never perfectly fine. Forget your modern, snow-white, all-purpose. This stuff is as rustic as it comes, flecked with chaff, tiny bits of stone for that extra dental challenge. In fact, archaeologists can spot skeletons from grain-grinding cultures by their ultra-worn-down molars, evidence that they've spent a lifetime chewing through not just bread, but miniature geology lessons in every bite. There's a reason medieval dental records tend to read like horror stories. If anyone had actually written them down. Grain milling wasn't just muscle work. It was fundamentally communal. In many places, villages had a shared millstone and people took turns. A built-in opportunity for gossip, matchmaking, and mutual complaint about how the monks take all the good grain for themselves. Sometimes, for those with access to a watermill or windmill, cutting-edge technology of their respective centuries, a professional miller would handle the job for a cut of your finished flour. But for a shocking number of people, especially women, patriarchy, daily life involved hours spent hunched at the quern, contemplating the crushing weight of time and stone. And speaking of existential dread, grinding grain was a metaphor for life in more than just a literal sense. Ancient poems and religious texts reek of symbolism around millstones and the endless turning of fate. Sisyphus had his boulder. Peasants had their querns. Everyone was busy pushing rocks in circles, all day long. The very act of making bread was shadowed by the awareness that harvests failed, stones broke, And if you weren't careful, you could lose a finger in that relentless mechanism. By noon, your forearms feel like they've been run over by an ox cart, and every article of clothing smells like something halfway between cereal aisle and an old library. A fine dust coats everything, face, lashes, even between your teeth. Still, there's a peculiar satisfaction. You and everyone you know are physically tied to your daily bread, each loaf the literal product of your labour, your sweat, and perhaps a bit of your dubious existential angst. So, next time you see someone on social media waxing poetic about heritage grains or hand-milled sourdough starter, remember, once upon a time, making flour from scratch meant double shifts at the gym, a side of grinding despair, and the world's worst dental plan. Eat your toast with gratitude. Maybe you're one of the lucky ones using the local mill. Except the air smells like old socks, and the miller might be padding your flour with absolutely anything. Yes, you get more bulk for your buck, but don't look too closely at the bonus ingredients. Now, let's step inside this creaky old mill together. Imagine a place so caked with dust that even the mice wear scarves. The millstone's been turning for decades, sometimes grinding wheat, sometimes, well, who really knows what gets in there? The good days bring added fibre in the form of weevils. On the bad days, you're better off not asking why the flour smells faintly of yesterday's fish. Of course, nobody's there just for the ambience. You're there because you need flour. Real flour. So you take what you can get. What the mill lacks in hygiene, it makes up for in rustic authenticity. The miller is a character, rumoured to have a thumb in every pie, and a secret stash of something. Nobody's quite sure what. He weighs your grain, raises a bushy eyebrow, and promises it'll be the finest flour this side of the dusty, unpaved road. He winks, emptying your sack into a hopper, and you try not to notice that last customer was definitely carrying barley, not wheat. The process itself is nothing short of magical. At least, it's supposed to be. You pass over your grain, and in return, you're handed back flour, but sometimes the sack feels suspiciously heavier than it should. Are you getting a great deal, or just falling victim to the oldest trick in the book? Maybe a little bit of both. No one asks too many questions, because in a town where gossip travels faster than bread rises, it's better to keep your complaints to yourself. Once home, you dump the flour onto your kitchen table. The sunlight catches on the dust motes dancing in the air, along with a few mystery specks you'd rather not investigate. You sift, you sniff, you sigh. Bonus ingredients is one way to put it. Total culinary chaos is another. There's a stray hair, a pebble, something that might have once been a beetle. Is that a hint of rye, or just plain old dirt? Hard to say. Still, you soldier on. The dough comes together, and you try not to think about the miller's sly smile as he handed you the bag. After all, beggars can't be choosers, and flour is flour. Until it isn't. Your bread comes out distinctly odd, lumpy here, sunken there, and faintly gritty no matter how much you chew. Maybe it's a regional specialty. Maybe it's just what happens when you trust a man whose apron carries more stains than stories. Over time, small-town suspicions bubble up. Mrs. Crumble says her biscuits refuse to bake through. Old Tom insists the miller's adding plaster dust when business is slow. Between the rumours and the odd off-colour loaf, folks whisper about what truly goes on behind those rickety doors. But nobody ever confronts the miller outright. He's just too important, too closely woven into the flour-dusted fabric of village life. You grumble, you laugh, you commiserate, but ultimately, you keep coming back. Because despite the mysteries and the occasional crunchy surprise, this is the mill you've got. In the end, your relationship with the mill and the flour is a strange blend of trust and resignation. You hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and always keep a sharp eye out for bonus ingredients. And so the magic of the mill rolls on, sometimes enchanting, sometimes alarming, and always, always unpredictable. Sometimes wheat's just too fancy, so you reach for rye, barley, or literally whatever was left after the rats finished their party. Suddenly, you're eating a loaf that tastes like disappointment and feels like chewing on medieval concrete. But here's the kicker. For most of human history, that sad, dense bread isn't the exception. It's the rule. Think you've had a bad day weeping over a cracker masquerading as sourdough? Imagine villagers 1,000 years ago who thought bread was supposed to taste like sand and regret. Rye, barley, oats. These weren't luxury alternatives. They were the last picks at the flour dodgeball tournament, and nobody volunteered. Yet in lean years, you made do, because a brick of barley bread beat the alternative, hunger. The flour pantry was less a place of abundance and more a lottery of, how bad will this loaf really be? Let's pause and ask, what makes wheat the darling of bread making anyway? Wheat flour has the superpower of gluten, that stretchy protein that brings joy and chew to modern bread. Without it, you're left with loaves that bake up flat, crumbly, or sticky in all the wrong ways. Rye, less gluten, more density, and an uncanny resemblance to brown Play-Doh when wet. Barley, virtually no gluten at all, so it clumps like old oatmeal. Oats, don't get me started. Unless your goal is experimental porridge cake, you'll need creativity or desperation. Essentially, wheat flour is the charismatic main character. The others are quirky supporting cast members, sometimes memorable, sometimes tragic. In a medieval kitchen, though, choice wasn't much of a thing. Failed wheat crops. You didn't go gluten-free by choice. You reached for whatever you could harvest, mill, or scrounge from last season's stores. Sometimes householders stretched their wheat with cheaper grains or, in really hard times, added acorns, beans, or chestnuts. Recipes from olden days read less like instructions and more like cheerful guidelines for edible survival. If you had access to sieved, finely milled, pure wheat, congratulations, you were probably royalty, or at least pals with the castle baker. But there's another side to this flour story. Yes, bread from rye or barley might break your teeth, but in colder, damper climates, where wheat hated to grow, cultures learned to work magic with underdog grains. Germans embraced dense, tangy rye for pumpernickel. Scandinavians perfected crisp breads from barley and oats. The Scottish made oatcakes a national treasure, as long as you defined treasure loosely. What started as necessity eventually became tradition, regional pride baked right into the loaf. Still, flavour delights or not, many alternative flours come with a catch. They're perishable, quick to spoil, and prone to hitch-free rides into your pantry with weevils, moths, and all manner of uninvited guests. Ancient bread wasn't just dense and earthy. It could be protein-rich in the worst way. Contrast that to refined white flour today, bagged in plastic and made to last. For our ancestors, baking with barley or rye was not just about taste. It was a race against time and pests. So the next time you sigh over a sad sandwich made from alternative grains, remember, you're participating in a ritual older than sliced bread, older, frankly, than people who even thought to slice bread. To our predecessors, bad bread wasn't a culinary misadventure. It was just another Tuesday. And if you're lucky enough to have wheat flour on hand, take a moment to appreciate that humble bag. 1,000 years ago, it would have been worth its weight in gold. or at least worth trading for something you didn't have to gnaw on in secret. Let me know if you'd like further revisions or a summary of the structure and style used above. Now, picture this. You bite into your bread and your breakfast starts hallucinating harder than a Burning Man extra. Meet ergot, a highly toxic fungus that infests rye, turning an ordinary meal into an accidental psychedelic experience. An occasional town-wide hallucination festival. That's right, before magic mushrooms had their branding department in the 60s, there was ergot. This unassuming mold nestled itself into loaves, rye breads, and all sorts of old-world carbs, often completely unnoticed by everyone involved, except, of course, when the townsfolk began their impromptu auditions for a medieval remix of Fantasia. Picture entire villages grooving to invisible orchestras, communing with saints who suspiciously resembled their neighbour's goat, or, less endearingly, writhing with muscle spasms and paranoid delusions. Ergot was not choosy in its effects. It was part pharmacy, part horror show, and part acid trip. And it wasn't exactly rare. Rye was the backbone of peasant diets across Europe, which meant this fungi was basically crashing the carbohydrate party everywhere from France to Russia. Imagine the mom at the bread market sighing, "If I had a penny for every time little Johannes thought the bread rolls were singing, I could afford some non-possessed grain." The real kicker though, nobody had a clue what was going on. It took centuries for anyone to suspect that their daily bread might be to blame for these very not holy visions. Let's put this into historical context. In 1692, the infamous Salem witch trials burned through Massachusetts like a bad Yelp review. A rash of bizarre behaviour, convulsions, hallucinations, wild accusations swept through the village. What's wild is that modern scholars think ergot could have been the true culprit, not the devil, or, as the locals claimed, suspiciously independent women. The suspects weren't wielding wands so much as inhaling rye toast with a hallucinogenic payload. So, the next time you wonder how mass hysteria grips an entire community, remember, sometimes it's not fear or politics, it's breakfast. But ergot's legacy isn't just historical outtakes and cautionary tales. In a strange twist, it's also the unlikely ancestor of LSD. Yes, the same stuff that powered Woodstock and countless college dorm posters. In the 20th century, a Swiss chemist tried to extract medicinal compounds from ergot and accidentally synthesized LSD. Suddenly, that medieval bread loaf doesn't look so outdated in the world of mind-bending experiences. Imagine explaining that to the town baker. Your sourdough changed the course of pharmaceutical history. Also, everyone's seeing unicorns. It wasn't all Technicolor dragon chasing, though. Ergot was deadly serious. Literally. Extreme cases caused gangrene, convulsions, miscarriages, and death. Medieval records are filled with descriptions of burning limbs and St. Anthony's fire, where sufferers felt like their hands and feet were aflame. And because public health campaigns hadn't been invented yet, towns often blamed curses, demons, or their favourite scapegoat, the mysterious travelling peddler. So, the next time you grumble about your gluten-free options or that sourdough starter on Instagram, spare a thought for the rye bread eaters of yore. Their farm-to-table experience sometimes included a bonus trip to hallucination station, courtesy of a fungus that just wanted to have a little fun, at humanity's expense. Ergot. The secret ingredient nobody asked for, but, if history is anything to go by, nobody could ignore. Ever chewed a baguette that felt like a dental test? Medieval grinding stones sometimes left tiny bits of grit in your flour, transforming every meal into a game of which tooth will I lose today. You can basically thank bread for early dentistry. Biting into bread back then wasn't just fueling up for another day of farm labour. It was a high-stakes gamble with your molars as the ante. Before industrial milling came to save our smiles, flour was ground between stones that wore down with every turn. So, the more bread you ate, the higher your odds of collecting a mouthful of shiny new fillings, assuming you survived the experience with teeth intact. Imagine starting your day in a chilly medieval kitchen. Breakfast? Stale bread? Yesterday's cheese? And maybe a little salted fish if you were lucky. Just as you broke off a hunk of sour, chewy loaf, you'd hear that uncomfortable crunch. Not from the crust, but from a pebble-sized stowaway nestled neatly inside the crumb. Think of it as the breakfast cereal with a real-life free prize inside. Except this one could crack a crown. And this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. Archaeologists regularly find medieval skeletons with teeth worn down or broken right to the gum line. Tooth decay, abscesses, missing molars. From peasants to kings, everyone was munching gravel, whether they liked it or not. Dental hygiene, as you can imagine, wasn't exactly trending. Toothbrushes. Never heard of them. Chewing on a rosemary twig was about as fancy as it got. Yet, people loved bread too much to give up. For most, bread formed the very base of the food pyramid. The average medieval European could eat a kilo, a massive 2 pounds, of bread per day. For the working poor, it was a simple equation. No bread, no life. They just hoped their dentist, well, their local barber surgeon, kept his blades sharp and his moustache cleaner than his instruments. And it wasn't just grit from the millstone. Sometimes the grains themselves, spelt, barley, rye, contained sand or tiny stones from being rinsed in the local river. So, even the best-intentioned medieval baker inadvertently added a little crunch to the daily loaf. The quality depended on your status. Nobles at least got the white bread, a finer sifted flour with, supposedly, fewer rocks, while peasants endured the hearty, brown bread full of fibre, vitamins, and all the grit one could ever wish for. This wasn't just a European struggle, either. Across ancient Egypt, Rome, and the Middle East, stones in bread were a universal annoyance. In fact, ancient Egyptians are said to have suffered terribly from dental problems thanks to their sand-speckled flatbreads. Their mummies have the dental records to prove it. Molars worn flat as river stones, pitted with abscesses after years of eating what was basically artisanal sandpaper. But here's the fascinating twist. Even with all this chewing adversity, bread's appeal never faded. In many ways, bread's rocky ride through history helped spark culinary innovation. Over time, better milling technology and sifting techniques made for softer, safer bread. The quest for the perfect loaf, with less surprise geology, pushed bakers and engineers to refine their craft. So, the next time you're slicing a feathery soft brioche, or tearing into a baguette with nothing more dangerous than a gluten allergy, spare a thought for your medieval predecessors. Their bread came with trace minerals, mostly because they didn't have a choice. But thanks to their persistence, and probably a bit of dental luck, you can enjoy carb loading without the threat of spontaneous medieval dental work. Let's all raise a toast to bread that won't break your teeth, because history has never tasted so good or been so merciful to your molars. Your sourdough starter is more like a biology experiment run amok, bubbling away in some dark corner, occasionally changing colours, and occasionally gaining sentience. If it moves, you just shrug and bake anyway. Survival of the hungriest. Here's the thing about sourdough starters. Nobody really tells you that it's less pet and more unruly roommate. Starters don't quietly sit in the fridge like a tub of respectable yogurt. No, they demand attention. They need feeding, burping, and, if you want to avoid them, staging a coup, regular surveillance. Forget them for a day? Prepare to discover they've developed a new ecosystem, complete with mysterious fluids pooling on top. You Google, "Is grey hooch safe?" and realise you are now a fermentation gambler, and possibly a danger to yourself and others. Of course, social media is no help. Instagram offers endless reels of glass jars, their contents frothing like artisanal clouds, smugly captioned, "Just fed my starter." Meanwhile, you're over here scraping a crust off what looks like a failed resurrection ritual, hoping there's anything edible left beneath. If you post a starter fail, sourdough evangelists descend in your comments, diagnosing your every misstep. You use tap water. That's basically biochemical sabotage. And suddenly you're convinced your starter needs psychotherapy, mineral water, and possibly a small trust fund. You begin to see your kitchen differently. Every container could be the starter's next prison. Every spoon a weapon in the ongoing battle against slime. Your family hears strange language. It's hungry again. I think it's sulking. And do you smell acetone? Or is it just me? The sour aroma drifts beyond the kitchen, permeating your home with an aura that says, science is happening here, and it might be alive. Eventually, you attempt the actual baking. This is where the curse flexes its power. Your dough could rise like a proud balloon, or lie there like a disgruntled pancake. It sticks to the counter, your hands, and anything within a 3-foot radius. Flour dust coats your floor, and the oven timer becomes your existential alarm. Hours pass, but defying logic, the loaf emerges both rock-hard and mysteriously hollow. Someone suggests rustic to be polite. You eat it anyway, teeth bravely crunching, just grateful the starter didn't mutate further. Yet, there's a strange loyalty that develops. Like people who adopt haunted dolls, you become invested. You give your starter a name. You defend its weird smell. You unzip your hoodie at 2 a.m. to check if it's happy. It's no longer about perfect bread. It's about winning a slow-motion battle of wills with a jar of animate goo. In the end, you're not baking for flavour. You're baking for glory. You're baking to prove that yes, your bubbling gremlin of a starter can produce something edible, eventually. If not, well, you've certainly learned a lot about tenacity, questionable science, and the value of kitchen bleach. Besides, someday, you might even get a loaf that gives you a standing ovation crackle, and a crumb shot worthy of a museum. Until then, you and your starter will endure, locked in an epic saga of hunger, hope, and microbial mischief. Time to mix your dough, using water from a well that would make modern health inspectors faint. The bread is rustic, earthy, and carries just a little extra immunity challenge every time you take a bite. But before we grimace in horror, let's take a step back and remember. The average medieval villager didn't have the luxury of filtering, testing, or worrying. Water from the well, a nearby stream, or even rain barrels was a daily gamble. Sometimes it tastes metallic, or a little marshy. Sometimes it simply tasted like whatever livestock had been upstream that week. It was what it was, a necessity transformed into ritual, heaped with prayers and crossed fingers. Of course, you learn to trust some water sources more than others. A well looked after by the whole community was prized, maybe even jealously guarded. Stories travelled fast about who had gotten sick from which stream, and local lore around blessed springs was often just hard-won folk wisdom wrapped in the silk of superstition. A bad well didn't just mean bad bread, it meant a bad season, or worse, a sick family. Bread made from water with character wasn't just about flavour, though let's be honest, there was probably plenty of that. It was about survival, If a batch came out especially funky, you chalked it up to Saint whoever's sense of humour, dunked it in your soup, and hoped for the best. On market day, you could always tell which baker's bread had the cleanest water. Their loaves were famous across town, not just for taste, but for giving you better odds of seeing next week. Was anyone actually boiling their water to make it safer? Well, not exactly for cleanliness's sake. Boiling water was more about making stew or brewing ale. Oddly enough, that's why ale was so popular and often safer than water. Boiling during brewing killed off nasties, and, bonus, you got a buzz with your hydration. Even children sometimes drank small beer, a weak ale, because it was less likely to send them to the apothecary than the stuff in the well. If you think that's rough, let's remember what didn't exist. Pipes, faucets, tap water, municipal treatment plants, chlorine, testing kits, none of it. For the majority, water was something fetched, and fetching meant a daily hike, carrying wooden buckets with a splashy payoff that had probably hosted everything from leaves to frogs on its way to your dough bowl. Now, sprinkle a pinch of realism on this. Water was heavy and precious. Nothing was wasted. Water used to wash wheat or flour found a second life in the garden, or even as part of the animal feed. Every drop was accounted for, and every villager was part of a not-so-secret water conservation club, joined by total necessity. Still, it wasn't all grim. There's something poetic in the way ancient communities adapted, blending superstition, tradition, and practical know-how. They might hang bundles of rosemary or sage over a well to bless it, only to discover some herbs did ward off bugs, or at least made the place smell a little nicer. And what about the taste? Every region's water gave its bread its own subtle signature. Limestone in the hills, traces of iron from old pipes, mossy notes from forest-filtered springs. These weren't artisanal choices. They were facts of life and the taste of home. Today, when we measure out clean cups of filtered liquid for sourdough or ciabatta, it's easy to forget that not so long ago, water was a central player in the theatre of daily risk and reward. For our medieval baker, the decision wasn't bottled versus tap. It was, which water won't hurt me today? And if your loaf came out hearty, crusty, and only a little bit risky, well, that was just a part of life's rich, questionable tapestry. So, next time you fuss over your water filter, spare a thought for your forebears. Their bread might not win any safety awards, but it shaped generations, immune systems, and maybe, just maybe, an appreciation for the wonders of clean water. Kneading dough is today's equivalent of a full-body workout and a therapy session rolled into one. If your therapist shouted at you and the gym smelled like boiled cabbage. If you ever want to know what it feels like to be a 19th century farmhand crossed with a contestant on Ninja Warrior, try kneading bread for 10 minutes. This is not the genteel, meditative pastime depicted in watercolor kitchen prints. It's flour-dusted mayhem, a slapstick arm workout, and, if you're not careful, an existential crisis kneaded into gluten. After only a few minutes in, your forearms vibrate. Your palms develop the sort of friction burns usually reserved for industrial machinery, and your kitchen counter looks like a culinary crime scene. And just when you think it's over, the dough, with all the forgiving elasticity of a toddler's tantrum, springs back defiantly, mocking your feeble attempts at domination. There's an art to kneading, or so the experts claim. The textbooks, scented faintly of overachieving sourdough, show bakers calmly folding and pressing dough with serene assurance. The Dalai Lama of carbohydrates. In reality, most of us approach the counter like a lumberjack wrangling a recalcitrant raccoon. Shove, fold, twist, repeat, add more flour, swear, repeat. After 5 minutes, sweat builds not just on your brow, but also in places you didn't realize you had while baking. If you're lucky, your Apple Watch interprets these furious gestures as active calories and rewards you with a congratulatory buzz. Ignore that it's actually just confused and thinks you've started a very slow, very local street fight. And kneading is not just physical, it's deeply psychological. This is the only acceptable adult scenario where pummeling something repeatedly is encouraged, even cheered. Got pent-up angst from work? Try slamming a dough ball against the counter while muttering about Janet from accounting. Marital tension? Channel it through a baguette to be. Some claim yoga brings inner peace. Perhaps they've never dispelled stress by punching focaccia into submission. It's a primal experience. Meditative with a hint of menace. As you work, the dough transforms, much like your perception of time. Kneading for 10 minutes feels like double overtime at a warehouse. Your hands ache, shoulders tighten, and yet, mysteriously, this slow, sweaty ritual becomes intoxicating. There's a rhythm in the stretch and fold, a sense of accomplishment, in feeling the dough go from sloppy sludge to springy resilience. In those moments, you're never just a home cook. You're an ancient artisan, summoning sustenance from the very ether, albeit while wearing sweatpants and humming ABBA under your breath. Of course, no one tells you about the residue left behind. The counter develops the adhesive properties of plywood in a rainstorm, and the dough clings to your hands like an overzealous puppy. You scrape, you wash, you find tiny dough balls in your hair hours later. It asks profound questions, like, can you truly ever have clean fingernails again? This is the real sourdough starter, the microbial life formed in the crevices of your cuticles. Yet, after all of this, there's an inexplicable satisfaction. You step back and survey your flour-strewn kingdom, arms shaking, nose dusted in self-raising pride. Your dough is vaguely round, slightly askew, sticking alarmingly to the edge of the table. But it's yours. You conquered the gluten beast and survived, a little flurrier and a lot sweatier. It transcends cardio. It's therapy, history, aerobics, and alchemy, all rolled into one sticky, beautiful mess. And if the result resembles artisanal bread, wonderful. If not, you've still burned 300 calories, exercised petty grudges, and rediscovered biceps you thought were lost to time. Now, someone pass the Bengay and a fresh cup of tea. There's still cleanup to do. Baking bread means dealing with communal ovens and fire that's almost always either too hot or cold as your ex's stare. There's a 50-50 chance your loaf comes out as either a savoury brick or a dense puddle. Let's set the scene. Imagine you're finally ready to bake. You've kneaded the dough for what felt like an eternity, fought off the chickens to keep your flour, and now you're lugging your sticky, shaggy blob over to the communal oven. This isn't your personal little oven with knobs, dials, and a helpful preheat button. No, this is a furnace operated by your neighbour, Bertram, who measures the temperature by how long he can keep his hand inside before it starts to sizzle. The standard units are ouch, smells like singed hair, and call the healer. Communal ovens are the epicenter of ancient community life. Picture a large dome, coughing out plumes of wood smoke, everyone taking turns, bustling in and out, trading gossip, arguing over who brought the best rye, and sneakily rearranging the embers to suit their own recipe. These ovens are less Maytag, more build a fire and hope the gods are in a good mood. If you want reliable temperature control, you're in the wrong millennium. Timing is everything, but clocks don't exist, at least not the way we know them. Some people claim they can judge doneness by smell alone, like some kind of rustic wizardry. In reality, It's usually a cross between wild guesswork and a prayer. Your loaf is joined by 11 others on the hot stones. If it comes out golden and crisp, you have bragging rights for a week. If it comes out looking like a sacrificial offering, well, it'll still get eaten. Eventually. There's a certain humility to pre-industrial bread. You eat your mistakes to spare your pride, but maybe you don't have access to a fancy community oven. Perhaps you're working with the next best thing. A heap of flat rocks arranged in a circle, simmering from hours of fire and hope. These primitive pseudo-ovens are where legends and occasional dental injuries are born. You pile heated stones in a pit, gently nestle the dough on top, and then wait. Maybe you even cover it with more rocks, just in case. It's very much a set it and forget it process, except if you actually forget it, there's a good chance you'll return to a sad, charcoal frisbee. Let's not forget the wild cards, wind gusts that steal heat, random pets that want a taste, or that one relative who tries to help by poking at your loaf every 10 minutes. Because nothing says even bake like a 5-year-old's curious stick. Fire baking does have its small victories. Every so often, everything goes right. The stars align. Nobody moves your bread to the wrong side. The fire's steady, and the crust sings with blistered perfection. For one fleeting moment, you are the bread champion. You stride home, loaf in hand, ready to share or gloat. But next week, it's back to uncertainty, smoke in your eyes, and sticky dough on your sleeve. So, why go through all this effort? Why not just eat grains raw? Well, bread is worth it, even when fire is unruly. A loaf, even a slightly misshapen one, means a full belly, a happy family, and a little taste of triumph. Plus, every smoky, wonky crust is a story, one you'll remember, laugh about, and, if you're lucky, pass down to the next brave baker in line. In the end, baking with fire is equal parts skill, superstition, and surrendering your ego to the flames. Whether you emerge with a masterpiece or a brick, you've joined the great, flour-dusted tradition of making bread the hard way. And honestly, that's half the flavour. There's nothing like lining up for the village oven, watching everyone try to disguise last week's disasters as rustic. You learn that patience is a virtue and desperation is universal. It's barely dawn. The roosters haven't bothered and neither have your neighbours. But already there's a parade assembling outside the communal oven. Pitchforks swapped for baskets piled with dough, sticky fingers fidgeting, and everyone armed with the battered hope that their loaves, this time, will emerge golden and impressive. The air is thick with wood smoke and anticipation, the kinds of aromas that linger stubbornly in your cloak for days. The line itself is more than just a cue. It's a living, breathing spiral of medieval social theatre. Last week, Marjorie's horse stepped on the miller's foot, so she's demoted to the back. Sir Baldwin, meanwhile, keeps flashing his knightly privileges card and gets nudged ahead, even though he still can't tell yeast from chalk. Hierarchies are never more visible than when bread is at stake. Time moves differently during these oven vigils. First, there's cautious optimism. Everyone exchanging tips. "Try adding an egg next time," whispers one villager, as though eggs are casually lying around for the taking. Then, impatient silence seeps in. The baker's apprentice enforces the order. No skipping, no poking the coals, and above all, no unsolicited commentary on anyone else's dough. Iron-fisted stuff, as far as bread jurisdiction goes. Idle gossip fills the void. Bread, after all, is the great democratizer. In line, peasants and nobility share the same nervous energy, trying to pass off collapsed lumps as innovative or scorched bottoms as evidence of pioneering spirit. Your crust is unique, is tossed out as both a compliment and a warning. Competitive banter flourishes beside a quiet solidarity. After all, Everyone remembers last winter's flour shortage and the parade of misshapen creative loaves. Sometimes the weight teeters into farce. Rumours circulate that the new priest can turn barley into rye. Spoiler, he can't. Or that Agnes's round, dense loaves can fell a grown man at 10 paces. True. Someone always tries to cut the line, only to be met with scandalised gasps. There's medieval justice, swift, theatrical, entirely bread-related. Then the bell rings. It's a sound that, depending on your position in line, means triumph, dread, or the exhilarating chance to feign nonchalance. The oven door swings open and smoke billows, equal parts promise and peril. The first batch goes in and everyone leans forward, watching loaves puff up or wilt, fortunes rising or falling in a burst of steam. When your turn comes, you offer your dough up to the mysteries of fire and hope the oven gods are accepting bribes this week. Bread in the medieval world isn't just sustenance, it's social capital, family pride, sometimes near mythical disaster. A perfect loaf can elevate your status, a charred sagging brick. Expect to be the butt of local jokes for months. Children gather for free samples, hoping their mother's loaf is one of the lucky ones. Even the local cats circle, sensing the imminent spillage of crumbs and pride. By the end, warm loaves are tucked under arms and heads are held high, or low if things went badly. The crowd disperses, already planning next week's tweaks, and wondering how the baker manages to stay so mysteriously unflustered. The oven cools, the queue dissolves, but the stories of success and soot-blackened humiliation linger like the smoke curling from the chimney, marking yet another chapter in the enduring saga of waiting for the bell. Did you think bread would survive the night? Hilarious. There's always hungry rats, brazen neighbours, or the occasional overexcited priest, accidentally, blessing his way to a free snack. No matter how carefully you set out your harvest of the day, stacked high and proud on the cooling racks or tucked under a frilly tea towel, there's a cast of characters lurking in the wings, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It's a universal truth, as reliable as sunrise. If your loaf is slightly misshapen, drier than last week's confessions, or just oozing temptation, it becomes fair game in the unspoken neighbourhood sport of bread thievery. Some call it survival, others call it a midnight snack. Out here, it's practically tradition. Start with the rats, those nimble agents of chaos. Forget what you know about cartoon rats stealing mere cheese. Real city rats have taste, and nothing says gourmet like fresh bread. With the stealth of tiny bread ninjas, they'll nibble straight through linen and brown paper, leaving behind evidence as subtle as a bulldozer in a croquet lawn, a scattered trail of crumbs and a dented heel where your perfect boule used to be. You might even hear their high-pitched bickering, blaming each other for taking too much. But by dawn, all that remains is the tattered echo of your hard work and the faint hope that you were dreaming. You weren't. But rats aren't the only offenders. Enter the bold neighbours. You know the sort, the ones who always appear at the fence line right as you're airing out your crustiest batch. They'll strike up a conversation that inevitably circles round to bread. Oh, is that sourdough? Did you really bake all of this yourself? Mind if I try a slice? Their eyes always linger a bit too long, and as dusk slides into night, you might just notice a slightly lighter basket on your back step. Was that wind, or was it Janine from next door, with her not-so-subtle sampling habit? Next time, maybe leave her a decoy slice, extra crusty, extra chewy, a test of neighbourly intent. And then there's the clergy. Yes, even men and women of the cloth have been known to succumb. Legends swirl in church kitchens, tales of a late-night blessing gone rogue, the communion bowl ever so slightly emptier. Crumbs on a cassock, guilt's new flavour. After all, isn't "Give us this day our daily bread" a command, not just a prayer? And who could begrudge a hard-working pastor a crust or two? Just don't expect divine intervention if your walnut loaf goes missing from the altar rail. God works in mysterious and often hungry ways. The deeper truth behind these midnight bread raids isn't just hunger. Dud loaves, lumpy, overproofed, or extra rustic, are irresistible because they're imperfect. They're an invitation to take a risk, to sneak a taste without the pressure of perfection or presentation. Quietly, controversy swirls. Is the bread thief a villain, or just the hero your kitchen deserves? Opinions differ, rules bend, and in the early hours, alliances form between bread lovers and bread lifters, united by a simple truth. Nobody can resist the call of a neglected loaf. So, what's a baker to do? Do you fortify your window ledges with chicken wire and booby traps? Or do you adopt the Zen approach and accept bread theft as a compliment of sorts? Some embrace the chaos, leaving a sign. For hungry souls, help yourself, but leave enough crumbs for the rats, and find that sharing actually breeds fewer hard feelings and fewer unsanctioned rescues by the local pious. Because in the end, rogue loaves have their destiny: to feed, to delight, and, sometimes, to vanish mysteriously. Whether lost to rats, neighbours, or a holy mission, every missing slice carries a story, and every crumb tells you this: your bread mattered even after midnight. And really, isn't that the greatest compliment of all? Stale bread. There are no bread crusts left behind. Every scrap gets dunked in ale, soup, or even reused as a sponge. You haven't truly lived until you've cleaned your table with your dinner. Bread is the eternal resource, the great silent hero of the medieval table. Unlike the glossy loaves at your local bakery, medieval bread is as likely to bite you back as to be soft and chewy. Most of it is dense, crusty, and hard enough to deflect casual knives. This isn't an accident. If your harvest might not feed you through the winter, every loaf matters. Nothing can afford to go to waste, and nothing ever does. In the lean years, when drought or blight shrinks the harvest, each crumb takes on a value that's hard to imagine today. Even the heels, the crusts, those odd nubs that would be tossed in a modern household, are treasured. They are dunked into hearty pottages until soft, or used as edible scoops to ferry food from board to mouth. Bread doesn't just fill the belly, it soaks up every last bit of broth, stew, or gravy, making sure that not a drop of nourishment is left behind. And when bread turns stale, a matter of hours in the damp or dry medieval air, its destiny is transformation, not disposal. Stale chunks get tossed into cauldrons where they thicken soups and add substance to broths. They can become the central ingredient in dishes like bread pudding, wherein crusty remains are revived with eggs, milk, and a little sugar if you're fortunate. The result? A luxurious treat, born from necessity. But the uses don't stop with food. Have some seriously rock-hard bread. In a world without disposable cleaning products, a chunk of ancient loaf serves as a handy table cleaner. Wipe up spills, mop up grease, scrub the wooden planks, then pop it back on the plate for the dogs. It's an edible sponge, and the line between home goods and lunch is more creative than we might imagine. Sometimes, especially at feasts for the wealthy, bread is elevated to the honoured role of trencher. Thick slabs are set as edible plates, soaking up meat juices and sauces. When the meal ends, the sauce-laden trenchers are distributed to servants or the poor, never wasted. The simple fact is, to throw away bread is to flirt with disaster. Tomorrow's harvest might fail. Next season's rains might not come. The bread you discard today could be your survival tomorrow. Bread is even recycled between species. Chickens and pigs benefit from the scraps, gaining nourishment that cycles back through the community as eggs and pork. The ecosystem of the table is circular and wise. There's also ritual and respect woven into every loaf. The biblical, "Give us this day our daily bread," is not poetry here. It's the purest expression of gratitude. Each loaf is a gift of precious, hard-won grain, sown and harvested by hand, milled with sweat, and baked in a wood-fired oven. Every bite is victory over hunger. In a land ever on the edge of feast or famine, bread is the lifeline. To waste it is to tempt fate. Children learn young. Break no bread unless you intend to eat it, and share every extra morsel with those who have less. This isn't just thrift. It's a collective insurance policy for hard times. So next time you're tempted to toss that dried-out piece of bread, remember the long-standing tradition. In this age, there is no such thing as just stale bread. There are only opportunities for ingenuity, frugality, and survival. One crumb at a time. It's morning again, and it's time for the most important meal of the day, and possibly your last, depending on the fungal content. You take a bite and hope your relatives don't turn into musical chairs by noon. Let's face it, bread for breakfast is almost as universal as regretting your snooze button choices. In every corner of the globe, from greasy diners in Ohio to elegant Parisian cafes, the humble slice of bread stands ready to be buttered, toasted, dunked, or devoured. But as you contemplate your carbohydrate-laden destiny, have you ever paused to ponder what really lurks in your morning loaf? Is that golden crust disguising more than just gluten? Enter stage left, the world of invisible fungi, where breakfast can go from basic to bizarre in just a few spores. Bread, as comforting as it may be, is a magnet for mold. The same softness that makes it perfect for artfully sopping up your egg yolk also provides the ideal environment for uninvited fungal freeloaders. Mold spores are everywhere. On your countertop, in the air, probably judging your kitchen hygiene right now. They descend on your bread with the gleeful abandon of confetti at a wedding, waiting for just the tiniest hint of moisture or warmth to launch their invisible takeover. Suddenly, what looked like a fresh start to the morning could become a game of microbial roulette. What makes this routine habit so risky? It's not just the off-putting green fuzz that eventually appears. Some fungi responsible for bread spoilage, such as Aspergillus, Penicillium, and Rhizopus, produce microscopic spores and, worse, mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are not the latest superfood, but rather a family of toxic compounds that can damage the liver, disrupt your immune system, and, in rare cases, leave you regretting more than your half-hearted attempt at making sourdough during lockdown. With flour and yeast flying willy-nilly in commercial bakeries, even industrially produced loaves are not immune to their charms. But don't panic. You're probably not going to keel over after munching on toast, unless, of course, you bravely ignore the blue-green Jackson Pollock festering on the crust. Still, even the smallest patch of unseen mold can send spores a surprising distance into your bread, meaning the whole loaf may be contaminated, even if only part looks suspicious. Those who like to live dangerously and cut the moldy bit off, thinking it's all good, are playing a statistical lottery that would impress even the boldest Las Vegas gambler. The irony? While most of us fret about carbs, gluten, or empty calories, it's actually this secret fungal lottery that's the real villain lurking in our bread bin, and the risk doesn't just belong to consumers. Bakeries worldwide lose millions as mold ruins stock faster than trendy diets can come and go. Supermarkets wage a constant Sisyphean battle against spoilage, rotating loaves at breakneck speed in hopes we'll buy, before the bread becomes an impromptu science experiment. So, what's the solution? Store your bread in cool, dry places. Consider freezing what you won't eat within a day or two, and resist the urge to sniff test leftovers with the recklessness of a myth-busting YouTuber. Skip bread entirely, and you might miss out on a centuries-old culinary tradition. Indulge daily, and you just might develop superpowers. Fungal detection, perhaps. As we reach the bottom of the bread basket, let us pause for a moment's silence. Not for the lost loaves, but for the optimism with which we greet each breakfast. Every slice is an adventure, a journey through wheat fields, and occasionally, fungal frontiers. Whether you toast, slather, or sandwich, one thing is certain. In the grand narrative of breakfast, bread always manages to keep us on our toes. Sometimes quite literally, if we're dodging mold spores before noon. Bread is social glue and social capital. Want to bribe a neighbour? Offer a loaf. Want forgiveness? Still bread. You haven't seen real networking until you've tried to exchange a lumpy loaf for a hot gossip. Let's face it, civilization has always run on favours and flour. In ancient villages, bread wasn't just food. It was the original handshake, the edible contract. Anthropologists have even uncovered ovens that predate written language, suggesting our ancestors discovered carbs and social contracts pretty much at the same time. The moment someone realized it was easier to forget they owed you a loaf than a goat, a new social currency was born. Bread became the backbone of barter. Even today, try arriving at a dinner party empty-handed. You'll see just how quickly modern etiquette links back to the old rulebooks. Bring bread, get smiles. Bring nothing, get side-eye. This wasn't only about generosity, it was survival, camouflage, even self-preservation. Sharing bread could mean you had enough to spare, and that's a discreet flex in any era. But bread giving was also a subtle way to test the temperature of your relationships. Is your neighbour a selfish hoarder, a generous giver, or, more dangerously, someone who re-gifts your sourdough at their next gathering? In villages where news travelled faster than yeast, your reputation rose and fell with each crumb. Social loafing, meanwhile, is what happens when too many hands reach for the same basket. Psychologists discovered that people tend to slack off in group settings, leaning back, letting others knead the dough, and then showing up just in time for the butter. Think of a potluck where one guest brings artisanal focaccia and another brings napkins. In Roman times, communal ovens were common. Everyone contributed dough, but not everyone put in the same effort. Predictably, there were always a few who somehow always forgot their turn and still managed a prime slice. Bread, in these contexts, exposed who was carrying their weight and who was just enjoying the feast. There's also a ritual to bread's role as currency. Consider the global lexicon. Breaking bread as a synonym for making peace. In medieval Europe, sharing salt and bread was thought to seal alliances, calm feuds, and prevent betrayal. The logic was simple. If you consumed bread together, you symbolically invested in each other's survival. And if you betrayed that trust, well, at least the history books would note your descents started with your table manners. Fast forward to the modern kitchen. The micro-societies we form, dorm rooms, office break rooms, online baking forums, recreate these ancient social contracts. Ever notice how one roommate always samples the banana bread, but never bakes anything themselves? Or how a forgotten loaf in the office fridge becomes a sort of passive-aggressive monument? Bread is still being used to test boundaries, cement alliances, and sometimes incite gentle mutiny. But at its core, communal bread is a kind of hopeful investment. It says, I trust you not to hoard. not to judge my questionable sourdough shaping, and not to sit back while others do all the work. When everyone takes part, from kneading to slicing, the bread tastes inexplicably better. Social loafing then isn't just a warning about group behaviour. It's a reminder of bread's power to reveal, reshape, and raise the character of our communities. So next time you break bread with friends or family, remember, you're not just passing the carb. You're participating in the oldest economy on Earth. And if you find yourself reaching for your third slice without offering to help with the dishes, ask yourself, am I the social loafer? If so, maybe show up with extra bread next time. Or at least, finally bring something better than napkins. The nobles are munching fine white bread. You're gnawing through something that looks and feels like it came out of a peat bog. It's basically medieval gluten shaming, with a side of class anxiety. Let's rewind to medieval Europe, where your social standing was instantly telegraphed by what you put on your plate. The choice between black and white bread wasn't just about taste. It was about status. White bread, fluffy and light, was the holy grail of the upper crust, literally and figuratively. To score a slice, you needed serious money, or the right birth certificate. The nobility and wealthy merchants didn't just prefer white bread because it tasted better. It was a visible badge of refinement, a culinary way of saying, look at me, my flour has been sifted so aggressively it's practically silk. Meanwhile, everyone else was left with black bread, which was actually brown, grey, or nearly black, depending on what roughage was mixed in: rye, barley, oats, even ground up peas and beans. All fair game. If it grew from the earth, someone tried to turn it into bread. The dense, tough loaves that resulted were the mainstay of peasants, the urban poor, and anyone not on the manor's VIP list. Each bite was a reminder. Not only are you not rich, but your food is actively reminding you of it. So why the colour divide? Technology, mostly, plus a dash of food chemistry and a heaping tablespoon of economics. Milling white flour was complicated and expensive. It required extra steps: fine grinding, sifting out the bran, discarding the germ. So, only a lucky few could afford it. Those same steps took out most of the fibre and nutrients, but no matter. Back then, being rich meant showing you could afford to eat unhealthily. The browner your bread, the harder your life, or so the logic went. Households aspired to marry into dough, literally, by working their way up the bread spectrum. A peasant who found a way to spring for something paler than shoe leather would show it off at village feasts. The well-to-do, on the other hand, made a show of never letting a crust of brown bread cross their lips. This wasn't just snobbery, it was self-preservation in the class Shark Tank. But the class war didn't end at the bakery door. White bread's aura was perpetually fragile. Its scarcity was artificial, propped up by regulations and social rules. In some regions, laws literally forbade bakers from selling white bread to commoners. Periodic wheat shortages made things worse. The aristocracy hoarded the best grains, and accusations of bread fraud, mixing cheap grains into white loaves, became a recurring scandal. If you got caught selling faux white bread to the nobility, you were in for a medieval-style lawsuit. Think angry lords and pitchforks, not sternly worded emails. In a weird twist, modern nutritional science has turned all this on its head. Today, health gurus wax poetic about rough, dark loaves packed with seeds and bran, the very same stuff our ancestors dreaded as hard times food. Whole grain is a wellness buzzword, while white Wonder Bread languishes on the bottom shelf. If only medieval peasants could see Instagram now. Yet, in both past and present, bread remains charged with meaning far beyond its calories. Back then, every crumb was a marker of your place in a rigid social order. Now, the bread aisle is still a battlefield, just with different signals: artisanal sourdoughs, gluten-free magic. $8 boules with hand-milled ancient wheat. The ghosts of the old class war linger in our shopping carts. Consider this next time you reach for a loaf. It's more than just a carb delivery system. It's a slice of history, a symbol of aspiration, survival, and rivalry, baked fresh in every era. On festival days, maybe you get a slice of spice or a handful of nuts. It's the medieval equivalent of pumpkin spice season, except everyone's suspicious and candied fruit counts as luxury. These were the days when the baker's imagination finally got to stretch its legs a little. Think of it as Great British Bake Off night, only your tent is drafty, the ovens are inconsistent, and Paul Hollywood definitely wouldn't approve of the flour. The average loaf might be simple on most days, but on holidays, whether it was Christmas, Easter, Michaelmas, or one of the saints' feast days, the breadbasket bulged with possibilities. Saffron, dried currants, ground ginger, caraway, even dabs of honey or rosewater crept from their hiding places, and suddenly the kitchen smelled less like survival and more like celebration. But let's not pretend things got entirely decadent. Medieval wild is still, by modern standards, pretty restrained. For most, an ornate bake meant that someone crumbled old cheese into bread dough or scored it in a sunburst pattern. If you were rich, sure, you could have a slab of almond cake dusted with imported sugar, enough to draw sighs from the peasants who made do with honeyed rye. The social divide at the table grew starker. While manor kitchens rolled out luxuries by the trayful, common homes might pool resources to splurge on a single, sweetened loaf. Still, these rituals mattered. Festive bakes weren't about everyday hunger, but anticipation. The rare arrival of spice or fruit in your bread marked the calendar just as much as any church bell. In fact, the storybook versions of plum pudding and fruitcake have their roots here, though the originals were denser, earthier, and preferred by anyone who had teeth strong enough to tackle them. These days were also competitions. It's not that everyone wanted to outdo each other, but there was a certain pride if your simnel bread was fruitier than the neighbours. Recipes were scrawled, adapted, and fiercely guarded, handed down like family heirlooms. Women would compare dried fruit ratios in hushed corners, men would sneak morsels from the cooling racks, and children would be bribed to secrecy with extra crust. Every region boasted its own festive treat. Hot cross buns for Good Friday, lardy cake for harvest, saffron buns in Cornwall. Sometimes, whole communities worked together to bake massive ceremonial loaves, or, when resources allowed, towering 12th night cakes, glazed with egg yolk and studded with surprises, a dried bean for the king and a pea for the queen, if you were lucky enough. These collective bakes weren't just about eating, but about performance, spectacle, and the folklore that bound villages together. Let's talk ingredients. The rarest addition wasn't even a spice or fruit at all. It was colour. Saffron, reserved for the truly special occasions, turned even plain bread into a golden spectacle. The cost was eye-watering, and a saffron loaf on Easter morning became the Instagrammable moment of its time, painting every table in shades of sun. Blanched almonds, currants from the south, and candied angelica filled festive pies whenever traders passed through with their precious cargo. Of course, by the time these ingredients reached rural villages, you could fit your haul into a thimble, but that didn't dampen anyone's spirits. Above all, festive bakes were about marking what mattered. In a world where every day blurred into the next through toil and repetition, these breads offered punctuation, a reminder that joy was possible, that seasons turned, and that sometimes even basic ingredients could come together and briefly, gloriously, pretend at opulence. The flavours might be subtle to us now, but in their time, each bite was a tiny holiday in itself, a chance to taste delight And, while the bakes have changed with time, that impulse of taking something ordinary and on special days, making it extraordinary, still lingers in every kitchen where someone, somewhere, decides to throw a handful of fruit into the dough, just because the day calls for it. If your loaf hisses, changes colour, or develops legs, maybe just skip breakfast. Medieval medicine doesn't cover possessed pastries. Sure, bread is a staple, but let's admit it. Sometimes it turns. One night, you have a soft, golden slice whispering, "Toast me," in your ear, and the next, it's plotting a hostile takeover of your countertop. It's easy to ignore the first warning, a suspiciously tough crust, a whiff of something that isn't fresh baked so much as biology experiment. Most of us, powered by optimism and laziness, convince ourselves it's just, hearty. But if you're using a steak knife on your sandwich, you might already be in trouble. First, let's talk about those subtle clues. Bread is not meant to do impressions of a sponge or sports shoe. If you poke it and your finger bounces back like you've just prodded a memory foam mattress, nature is trying to tell you something. The colour spectrum is also important. Bread should not have mystery hues. Flashes of green, blue, or a suspicious greyish fuzz mean your carb companion has crossed over to science project territory. This is not artisanal. It's an ecosystem. And the smell. The telltale aroma of impending regret. Let's say you open the bag and an odour reminiscent of old gym socks hits you. Or, worse, that sharp, musty tang of mould. People will do impressive mental gymnastics to rationalise this away. Maybe it's just a new rye recipe? No. Smelling like a fungal battleground is never on trend. Some warning signs are less obvious but equally disturbing. If you spot condensation inside the bag or cling film, that's not moisture retention. That's a bacteria after party. Bread should not squelch. It should also not, under any circumstances, attempt to walk away. If you see movement, be it from insects, curious tendrils of mould, or because you forgot a loaf so long it sprouted a beard, congratulations, you've grown a pet, not a snack. Then there's the classic, just cut around it move. Slicing off the off-colour bit and hoping for the best is the bread equivalent of tossing a blanket over a haunted painting. The part you see is just the tip of the fungal iceberg. Given the bread's soft and porous structure, those invisible mould roots may have infiltrated every corner, plotting in silence. Out of sight, out of mind, does not apply to spores. These are not benevolent fairy tale mushrooms. Their agenda is gastrointestinal havoc, not woodland whimsy. If your bread attempts communication, hissing when you open the bag, or resisting the knife with suspicious vigour, it's not gaining sentience, but you should still back away slowly. This is how ancient curses start. Let's not even get into weird add-ons. Raisins, seeds, and oats are fine. But if you spot unknown extras, strange bubbles, weeping liquids, or a crust that flakes off with a puff of spore dust, you've entered the last act of your loaf's life, and it's not a happy ending. The bottom line is, bread doesn't get better with age. Despite what your frugal instincts or medieval survival fantasies may say, you are not a pioneer living on the frontiers of botulism. Sometimes you must let go. Thank your brave bread for its service and lay it gently to rest in the compost. Or if it's truly alarming, seal it away like the cursed artifact it's become. Remember, great toast begins with living bread. If your slice is fighting back, surrender the toaster tongs and step away. There's always cereal. Sometimes, when ergot hits just right, the whole town takes a collective trip to land. Neighbours start speaking in tongues, the chickens are briefly elected mayor, and you question all your life choices. But let's back up a second. What exactly is ergot, and how did it end up starring in one of history's greatest group freakouts? Ergot is a funky little fungus that likes to crash the party on rye and other grains. When conditions are just so, humid, a bit dank, maybe the grain's been left in a barn that doubles as a bat hotel. Ergot infests the crop. Grind that tainted rye into flour, bake it into bread, and voila, you've accidentally whipped up a batch of hallucinogenic sourdough that puts your friend's kombucha to shame. Picture this. It's the 1600s, and you live in a sleepy French village. The biggest scandal last month was someone's goat nibbling on Madame Leblanc's laundry. Now, suddenly, everyone's seeing visions of fiery demons at breakfast, writhing in the streets by lunchtime, and plotting to overthrow the village priest by dinner time. All because last week's rye harvest was a little fuzzy. This wasn't just a few people having a bad reaction either. Whole communities would be struck at once. The historical term for this wild scene: St. Anthony's fire. Spoiler: no saints, lots of burning. In classic medieval fashion, no one suspected the bread. They figured the devil himself had taken up residency, or perhaps an angry saint was just in a bad mood. Local authorities tried every cure imaginable: exorcisms, burning herbs, and of course, more bread, which, hilariously, just made things infinitely worse. Need to purify your soul? Sure. But maybe check if the bakery's run by a colourfully dressed shaman first. Symptoms of ergot poisoning, officially called ergotism, ranged from mildly inconvenient, tingling fingers, a dash of paranoia, to full-on horror show, seizures, blistering skin, and some pretty nightmarish hallucinations. In some outbreaks, townsfolk danced uncontrollably for days, claimed to witness portals to heaven and hell, or pointed fingers at their favourite scapegoat, witches. Sorry, witches. You can blame poor quality control. But while these episodes were undoubtedly terrifying, they inspired some truly spectacular creativity in the explanation department. Need to figure out why Bernard is convinced he's a sunflower. Easy. Witchcraft. Why is half the village suddenly speaking Latin backwards and chasing the chickens with sticks? Obviously, a curse. Behind the absurdity was real tragedy. Entire crops had to be destroyed, lives were lost, and villages became infamous for generations. Yet, for modern readers, it's hard not to appreciate the surreal humour. You can almost imagine the town elder, utterly perplexed, declaring, "From now on, we only eat potatoes." Ergot doesn't do potatoes. Today, food safety regulations keep our bread blissfully ergot-free. But echoes of these mass poisonings that linger in history, a reminder that sometimes group madness has a very mundane culprit. Forget elaborate conspiracies or supernatural plots. Sometimes the answer is just bad bread. So the next time you're at the bakery, marvel at your ergot-free croissant and give a silent nod to science. Remember the villagers who went toe-to-toe with nightmarish fungi and, in their confusion, may or may not have appointed a chicken as head of sanitation. In the epic struggle between humanity and its bread, it turns out the real hero might just be the modern health inspector. And if your neighbour ever starts declaring their sandwich possessed, maybe just check the ingredient list before calling the local exorcist. The family gathers to bake, ensuring at least 2 people cry, 1 person gets burned, and the cat is never the same. It's bonding, but mostly trauma. The evening begins innocently enough, the scent of flour, butter, and delusion wafting through the air. Each family member is assigned a task that matches both their aptitude and their willingness to complain loudly about unfair labour distributions. Dad, with visions of Great British Bake Off glory, volunteers as project manager and promptly disappears behind a flour-dusted copy of some recipe printed from the internet. He insists it requires strict timing, a phrase he'll later regret. As the clock spins wildly, out of anyone's control. Mum, bracing herself with a glass of baking wine, attempts to mediate between the children, two sworn rivals specializing in sabotage and noise pollution. She distributes bowls and spatulas like peace offerings at the world's least effective summit. The older sibling, tasked with measuring flour, immediately takes a phone call for a minute, leaving a dust storm in their wake. The younger one, having acquired both sugar and a concerning amount of unearned self-confidence, pause with abandon. Keys stick between measuring cups and phone screens, the precise amount of sugar destined to be a family mystery. Midway through, things unravel. Dad returns, recipe in hand, barking about preheating the oven and mise en place, terms he picked up from a single YouTube video and now wields with the authority of Gordon Ramsay over a troop of gremlins. Meanwhile, the cat, once a silent observer, is drawn by the scent of spilled vanilla extract and leaps onto the counter in an elegant arc, right into a mixing bowl. In the ensuing chaos, someone shrieks. Nobody is certain who, possibly even the cat. A consparpramring. I from when. Milk spills, and for the next 10 minutes, everyone debates whether cat hair is actually a significant allergen or just extra protein. Hang is abavstein invaluable. The youngest, affronted by a lack of sprinkles on their allotted cookie, takes it as a personal attack, worthy of televised drama. Tears glide dramatically down flour-streaked cheeks. The older sibling, tasked with rescuing what's left of the dough, manages to upend the bowl in a single, graceful clatter that would make any klutz proud. Dad responds by hyperventilating into a kitchen towel, while Mom mutters, "This is fine," and refills her glass. For a brief moment, hope glimmers. Cookie dough balls line an actual tray. Sprinkles, now rationed like precious gems, dot the surfaces. The oven preheats, eventually, after it's discovered that someone turned on the broiler instead. Tension eases just long enough for someone, inevitably Dad, to grab a tray with bare hands. There's a sharp yelp, a mad scramble for cold water, and a round of rapid-fire blame so seamless the family could win an award for speed and creativity. And yet, between the smoke alarm's piercing accusations and the cat licking the remnants of a doomed meringue, there's a glimmer of victory. Lopsided cookies take shape. The youngest gets to sprinkle extra sugar on a batch meant only for the neighbours. Dad, amid muttered "never agains," admits they taste surprisingly edible. Mum declares them perfect, meaning she will not endure this again until next year. The older sibling posts obligatory photos, cropping out the carnage for Instagram, and the youngest finds forgiveness in a chocolate chip. In the end, the kitchen looks like it hosted an amateur weather event. The cat resigns to a lifetime of cautious curiosity, and at least 2 family members vow to stick to store-bought. Tradition, after all, is less about perfection and more about surviving another round. Together hearts, mostly, unbroken, and cookies, miraculously, still warm. Hunger sets in hardest when the pantry looks and sounds suspiciously empty. Suddenly, every crumb is a treasure, and you're rethinking your stance on eating shoes. But as bleak as it may seem, true resourcefulness shines brightest when options feel non-existent. Let's be honest. Most of us find the idea of genuine hunger so abstract, it's the kind of thing that only happens in novels about old-timey orphans or on bleak reality TV shows. But when your stomach is louder than your neighbour's TV, you realise how creative desperation can get. You eye packets and jars you once dismissed, mystery condiments, single-use sauces, the heel of stale bread. Now they're elevated, each one a potential hero in your next meal. This is where the art of breadcrumb living comes into play. It's not just about literal breadcrumbs, although, yes, those dry remnants hiding at the bottom of the bag suddenly become golden. It's about switching into a mindset where small, seemingly insignificant things begin to appreciate in value. There's an unmistakable dignity in making something from nothing. No eggs? Maybe there's a potato rolling around in the crisper. No fresh produce? That withered onion is about to get its moment in the spotlight. Suddenly, the act of scavenging isn't pitiful. It's resourceful, almost noble. A tale you'll tell one day with a laugh. Let's get tactical. Here's where you pull a full MacGyver in the kitchen. Raid the freezer for half-used vegetable packs, the fridge for a corner of cheese, the back of the cupboard for a forgotten can of beans. Got half a tortilla? That's now a pizza base. Stale bread? Toast it in butter, sprinkle salt, and call it rustic. And don't discount flavour. Sometimes a dash of hot sauce or a shake of dried herbs can transform the sad into the sublime. At this low point, it's less about the ingredients and more about inventiveness. If you've ever watched a magician pull a rabbit out of a hat, you're about to pull dinner out of nowhere. But surviving on breadcrumbs is more than a culinary lesson. It's an exercise in perspective. When you strip away abundance, you tap into a primal sense of gratitude. The first bite, no matter how humble, feels like a feast. It's communal, too. There's a reason stone soup stories resonate. Sharing whatever's left, pooling your scraps with someone else's, makes the meagre seem plentiful and the moment feel meaningful. Of course, it's not always plucky optimism. Sometimes, enduring lean times demands stubborn resolve. There will be moments when the best you can manage is tea and a dry cracker, or leftover rice turned into oddly textured porridge. That's okay. Surviving isn't always about thriving or discovering hidden pleasures. Sometimes, it's simply about making it to tomorrow humour intact. And that's where the real story is. Hard times, at their core, are a test of spirit more than skill. They teach you to stretch, to savour, and to surprise yourself with what you can endure and what you can create with next to nothing. So next time you're down to the breadcrumbs, remember, this is the chapter future. You will look back on, proud and a little amused at how you got by. And maybe, someday, you'll find yourself making breadcrumb casserole by choice, if only for the story it carries. In the end, surviving on breadcrumbs is about more than surviving. It's about learning to spot hidden abundance, not just in the pantry, but everywhere. Because when times are dire, your greatest asset is creativity. And that, thankfully, is always in stock. The plague rolls through, and bread is both comfort and anxiety. Source. Is it safe? Is anything safe? Is it too late to become a carrot farmer? Bread, in an era when disease crept behind every closed door, was far more than a humble staple. It was currency. It was hope. And on bad days, it was a cruel reminder that the world was not as safe or simple as it used to be. Every loaf sliced into the foggy air of a panicked kitchen came with questions. Did the miller wash his hands? Where did the flour come from? Did the baker cough yesterday? Even superstition got a seat at the table. Hasty prayer whispered over crusts, a slice left out for the wandering souls, and of course, the unprovable conviction that rye warded off demons, and, please, any bacteria lingering in the oven. The public mood pivoted around bread. Famine bred fear during failed harvests, but the arrival of plague twisted those fears into something stranger. Bakers' shops became public theatres of suspicion, much like a modern pharmacy in flu season. Loaf in hand, you squint at your neighbour. Is their sniffling contagious, or just a reaction to last night's onions? Village gossip swirled thicker than soup. Bread from that bakery caused coughs, and that other batch simply felt wrong in the belly. And then there was the bread itself. In the best of times, wheat was prized. But with fields lying fallow and workers lost to illness, expectations collapsed. Any bread at all was lucky. Rye bread, barley bread, bread bulked out with lentils, or in bleakest moments, sawdust. The texture of plague bread, coarser, darker, with scattered seeds or even ground beans to stretch the meagre yield. A slice broken open on a wooden board told a story of survival, of adaptation, of families refusing to go hungry, even in the shadow of mass graves. But food wasn't just about sating hunger or easing a gnawing stomach. It was ritual, connection, and for some, a frail lifeline to normalcy. People tried to keep their traditions alive around dim candles. Black bread suppers with pickled onions, thin porridge flavoured with hope, and a little stale ale. Crumbs carefully swept into a rag to avoid the ill omen of waste. Plague-time meals ran on a different tempo. Hushed, quick, wary of neighbours, wary of news. You ate, you blessed the loaf, you peered into your mug, and you listened for bell tolls echoing the fate of the quarter. Resourcefulness became its own recipe. Stews thickened with whatever could be spared. Roots and wild greens foraged in secret corners, under threat of both hunger and fear. Old, dried bread was never thrown out, soaked in broth, fried in lard, crumbled into pottage. Housewives swapped tips and talismans, garlic against infection, sage for courage, and the ever-popular vinegar posset for both flavour and feint, desperate protection. Many avoided markets altogether, nature offering a kind of patchwork pantry. The bravest gathered nettles for soup, wild berries for a sweet tart pie, dandelion greens to steel the nerves. Eat what you have, share what you can became not just a proverb, but daily necessity. It was community that kept some alive, neighbours pooling supplies in dark hours, bartering onions for eggs across fences, or trading recipes that made the meanest fare a touch more bearable. Yet dining under the spectre of plague was always tinged by the knowledge that even food might betray. Bread, bearer of relief and worry alike, sat at the centre of every table, a symbol, a sustenance, a silent question. Is this bite a comfort or a risk? Will it nourish, or will it become another story to whisper in the narrow alleys? He ate, and then he fell ill. So maybe it isn't too late to become a carrot farmer. Maybe fear and flour and a dash of luck are all that stand between today's supper and tomorrow's uncertainty. But for tonight, with darkness pressing against the shutters and the smell of warm bread in the air, the dining table becomes a fortress, and the next mouthful a fragile act of faith. The only time you see a majestic loaf is during major ceremonies, or, hilariously, funerals. Leave it to medieval life to celebrate your birth, marriage, and death with carbohydrates. Picture it. The village is buzzing, not for a harvest festival or a royal decree, but for something truly momentous. A wedding. News spreads, the church bells practice their peals, and suddenly everyone's neighbour is giving advice on the seating chart. In the heart of all this hullabaloo, tucked among the mutton pies and turnip soups, sits an enormous, intricate loaf of bread. This is not your average everyday round of rye. This is bread in its Sunday best. Braided, decorated with seeds, sometimes even shaped like flowers, birds, or, if you're very lucky, a slightly lopsided heart. For one day, bread has the starring role, more ornate and revered than any roast. And yes, it appears again at funerals too, demonstrating medieval balance. One glorious loaf to send off the living, one solemn one to honour the dead. At a wedding, the bread is broken with laughter and wine. At a funeral, it's shared quietly, just as symbolic, but carrying the weight of goodbyes. not beginnings. Either way, people gather, plates are passed, and for a brief, carbohydrate-laden respite, the community reminds itself of the comforting constants: love, loss, and the alchemy of flour and yeast. The recipe for these ceremonial breads is something of a well-kept family secret. Passed down through so many flour-dusted hands, even the best chroniclers of the age couldn't pin down the origin. What sets this bread apart isn't just its ingredients, although a richer bride might claim a bit more butter or a sprinkle of the merchant's coveted spices. It's the time and care, the braiding and shaping, the wishful thinking woven into every strand. An everyday loaf might harden to the consistency of a small paving stone by morning, good for soup thickening or possibly self-defense. This bread, on the other hand, stays soft and fragrant, at least until the last heel has vanished. The symbolism is thickly layered, much like the bread's crust. At weddings, tearing the loaf and sharing it isn't just about feeding a hungry crowd. It's a ritual sign of fortune. If the bride gets the larger piece, she's destined to rule the household, or at least win the next argument over firewood. At funerals, parting the bread is an act of remembrance. We all share the same loaf, the saying goes, just on different days. What better way to honor the complicated recipe of life? Of course, the fancy bread also works as a useful distraction. While young cousins are elbowing each other over the best slice, the adults get a moment to recall the dearly departed, or to speculate on which neighbor is next in line for nuptial bliss. Did you see how much honey was in that glaze? Someone was trying to impress. The bread is an edible conversation starter, a centerpiece that invites gossip or solace with equal ease. It's important to remember, this was not bread for the everyday table. The average meal involved humble, serviceable rounds, chewy, dense, unadorned. The fancy bread required planning ahead, saving up for extra flour, and scheduling a spot at the good oven. Families would pool resources and time to make the loaf just right, knowing that for these few occasions, appearances mattered. In a world where surprises often came in the form of rain, rodents, or rumor, the ceremonial bread was a rare delight, predictable as the sunrise, but special as a comet. So, the next time you see a massive, glistening loaf commanding center stage at an ancient feast, remember, in the medieval world, no occasion was complete without a bit of spectacle and a generous serving of starch. Births, marriages, or mournful goodbyes, the bread, in all its ornate glory, was there to mark the moment. And if someone tried to sneak a slice early, well, that was simply the first joke of the party. Fast forward to your cozy kitchen, and it hits you. Infinite bread options, zero ergot, and working teeth. It almost makes you forgive the no-carb diet craze. There's a near-religious hush as you stand in the bread aisle today. Sourdoughs rising like cathedrals, gluten-free loaves priced like fine wine, multigrain concoctions festooned with more seeds than a botanical garden. Everything is soft, uniform, and more or less guaranteed not to induce either a dental emergency or an existential crisis. The most dangerous thing lurking in modern bread is perhaps a rogue chia seed, sneakily stuck in your molar, the perils of progress. Compare this to our forebears, who spent their lives gambling on each meal, hoping it wouldn't break their bicuspids or trigger apocalyptic hallucinations. Our daily bread, in all its sliced, bagged convenience, is now purchased by people who have the luxury of debating which brand has the higher crust-to-crumb ratio, or whether the dough was massaged by artisanal monks. You can schedule bread delivery, customize your loaf with the swipe of a touchscreen, and watch instructional videos on toast optimization, all in under 5 minutes. Meanwhile, The medieval peasant would simply like to remind you that their recipe for longevity was don't eat the purple bits inside the loaf. Nothing says modern blessings quite like toasting your bread without having to first commission a local blacksmith to wrangle your breakfast into submission. The drama of will I survive breakfast has been replaced by did someone eat the last cinnamon raisin bagel, or the universal lament of the half-eaten sandwich left in the fridge. Who took my lunch? The stakes for bread have never been lower, and that's deliciously comforting. And yet, with all this breadly abundance, we still manage to complain. The crust is too thick, the crumb is too dry, or heaven forbid. The expiration date has passed by a whopping 18 hours. Social media influencers share strategies for reviving stale bread with mystical rituals involving ice cubes, microwaves, and the careful recitation of, "You've got this." The modern anxiety isn't of ergot or shattered molars, but of missing out on the perfectly golden Instagram toast. Somewhere, a medieval miller is rolling their eyes. Perhaps that's the lesson after all. Surrounded by sanitized, sliced, and shipped to your door loaves, it's easy to forget the trading up our ancestors managed, with each generation less likely to be done in by their dinner. Countless tiny victories lie behind every chewy bagel and pillowy slice, agricultural improvements, medical advances, and plenty of trial by fire, sometimes literally. You are lounging at the end of a 10,000-year relay, baton in hand, about to complain that your rye isn't earthy enough. That's progress in a nutshell. The next time you pass through the bakery section, pause for a moment of gratitude, a silent thank you to every jawbone that paved the way. Think of those ancient souls, gnawing their way through stone-like loaves, hoping for sustenance without side effects. They might not recognize your featherlight ciabatta or your supermarket's rustic but suspiciously flawless baguette. But they'd surely appreciate a world where bread is an easy joy, an edible routine, not a game of gastronomic Russian roulette. So, as you drift off tonight under clean blankets, with all your teeth and only pleasant dreams, you might want to thank the countless medieval souls who risked everything for bread that could double as a home security system and an accidental psychedelic. We owe them for proving that survival sometimes means biting the crust, enduring a crunchy surprise, and making comedy out of catastrophe. Sleep easy, knowing your bread won't fight back, your starter won't grow legs, and your breakfast isn't a medieval dice roll for dental disaster. History is messy, absurd, and wonderfully human. And hey, at least your midnight snack probably won't hallucinate its way out of the fridge. Good night. So as you drift off tonight under clean blankets, with all your teeth and only pleasant dreams, you might want to thank the countless medieval souls who risked everything for bread that could double as a home security system and an accidental psychedelic. We owe them for proving that survival sometimes means biting the crust, enduring a crunchy surprise, and making comedy out of catastrophe. Sleep easy, knowing your bread won't fight back, your starter won't grow legs, and your breakfast isn't a medieval dice roll for dental disaster. History is messy, absurd, and wonderfully human. And hey, at least your midnight snack probably won't hallucinate its way out of the fridge. Good night.